substitute our front yard instead of our backyard. And Mr. Lister wrote back, I think the issue is referring to strong and proud nations as being in our yard. And it would be better if we just referred to them as our neighbors. This is a long and I think rather convoluted way of my saying that it's really a bit of an escape for me to leave Washington and come out here to the far more mellow metropolitan area of Denver and leave this turmoil for a moment, at least minute by minute, behind. And allow me to just take a few minutes and to take you with me as I transport myself back to what I consider the more neighborly days of U.S. relations in the region, especially the bilateral relations with Cuba. Just a few weeks from now will be the third anniversary of President Barack Obama's history-making trip to Havana. He was there for 2 days in the fourth week of March. I had the honor and the privilege of being part of the White House press corps that flew down with him and followed him around the island. And I got to see kind of up close the concrete gestures that a U.S. president was making for friendship, for neighborliness with the Cuban people and their government. In an effort, as Obama put it, to reset relations, not only with Cuba, but with the rest of Latin America as well. How did he do this? Well, to start with, when Air Force One touched down on the tarmac in Havana, Obama got onto Twitter, and he tweeted out a slang expression in Cuba, que vola. Does anybody know what that means? It's not an expression that's used in very many Latin American countries, but in Cuba it's used, and it means what's up, basically, what's happening. And for the President of the United States to try and engage the Cuban people from the second he arrived with that expression caught a lot of people's attention. Those of us in the press corps that were following him watched him visit the Jose Marti monument in Revolution Square. That is where this now famous picture of him standing in front of the big image on the wall of the building behind him of Che Guevara was taken. An image that, frankly, in my lifetime I didn't think I'd ever see. We watched him convene a town meeting with about 500 young Cuban entrepreneurs, cuentapropistas as they are known, who make up the growing private sector in Cuba. And Obama brought with him on his plane an entourage of U.S. businessmen, CEOs of companies like Google and Airbnb, the world-famous chef Jose Andres, many, many others, to meet with the young Cubans who were starting their own businesses and were self-employed in Cuba. We watched President Obama and Michelle Obama go to two of Cuba's most renowned paladares, the private restaurants, which are very representative of the new private sector and Cuba's move away from a strictly communist economy and more towards a socialist market economy. And we watched him and his family engaged in what I call baseball diplomacy, going with Raul Castro and his family to sit in the front section of the National Baseball Stadium and watch the Tampa Bay Rays play the Cuban national team. And by the way, Tampa Bay won. And we were also there, all of us reporters, at the venerable Grand Theater. It's known as the Alicia Alonso Theater now. Beautiful, old, at least 100-year-old theater, where Obama gave one of the more remarkable speeches of the many, many speeches that I'm sure some of us in the room remember him giving. He gave this speech before, with Raul Castro in the balcony and the entire Cuban Communist Party Politburo sitting there. You can imagine the scene, this beautiful ornate theater, beautiful balcony with all the Cuban dignitaries in it, and then underneath the balcony, in the back of the orchestra, were all of us reporters sitting literally underneath the leadership of all of Cuba, all the leaders. And it was a truly dramatic moment when Obama looked across the auditorium to Raul Castro and said, "I've made it clear that the United States has neither the capacity nor the intention to impose change on Cuba. I want you to know that my visit here demonstrates that you need not fear a threat from the United States." Let me just say that Obama not only spoke to Cuba's leadership directly, but he also spoke to the population at large. His speech in that theater that day was on the radio, it was on television, and I would say that the majority of Cubans tuned in. And even more important, if you can believe it, while he was in Havana, Obama taped a cameo appearance on Cuba's most popular television show. It's a satirical comedy called Vivir del Cuento, which roughly translates into live by your wits. And it's a show that features Cuba's leading television personality, an actor named Luis Silva, who goes by the name of Panfilo, on this show, which airs once a week on Monday nights for half an hour. And Panfilo is your average Cuban, living in your average small Cuban apartment and dealing with all the complexities and frustrations of the Cuban economic and political system in everyday life. And just 2 days before Obama actually arrived in Cuba, he appeared in a segment that the White House had coordinated with this show, where Panfilo calls him on the telephone. And this had been a running gag on the show, that Panfilo would pick up his phone and try and call the White House to complain about the situation and about U.S. policy, and of course nobody would ever answer. But this time he calls, and the screen cuts in half, and there's Obama sitting in his office, and he picks up the phone, and he says, "Hello," and Panfilo says, "¿Quién es esto?" And Obama says, "Hello," and they have a conversation. And so this actually aired in Cuba as a tone setter before Obama actually arrived. But then while he was there, he cut away at the end of one of his official events and filmed a second segment of actually visiting with Panfilo. And there's no way for me to describe this, so I actually want to show it to you. And so you get the flavor of the meaning of this extraordinary kind of coming together of our two societies, our president and Cuban society.
Laxizante Jarón.
Nuevita Puerto Mar. Ahí está. Septeto veneno. Caballero, yo creo que esto se trancó.
¿Sí? Esto se trancó, no, esto lo que está es aburrido, que lo que hace falta es una cuarta persona para poder jugar en pareja, que si no así no es que juegue.
Vamos, mire ese hombre que está allá atrás, como se parece a Obama.
No se parece a Obama, es Obama.
Real Panfilo.
Oh,
Mucho gusto.
Obama.
¿Cómo está?
Muy bien, muy bien, muy bien, muy bien, muy bien. How are you? No me puedo creer, Obama.
Good to see you. Real Panfilo, I said I would see you in Havana.
Sí, oh, sí, nos estamos viendo en La Habana, nos estamos viendo, claro que sí. ¿Qué bola?
Ah, bien, bien. ¿Qué bola?
Ellos son my friend, mis amigos, Facundo, Chequera. Ellos dicen que la llamada telefónica fue un chiste. They told me that the telephone call was a joke.
No, it was no joke. Panfilo finally reached me in the White House and I talked to him on the phone.
Que fue verdad, que fue verdad. Vamos a cantar, vamos a cantar. Sí.
1, 2, 3 y
Obama, Obama, qué bueno que viniste a conocer La Habana. In English. Obama, Obama, so nice you came to Havana.
That's a beautiful song. Thank you so much. You guys are playing dominoes?
Sí,
I've always wanted to learn how to play dominoes.
Dice que le hubiera gustado aprender a jugar dominó. Ah, pues le enseñamos.
Okay, so what's the trick here?
Sí, es fácil, se aprende fácil. Entonces, primero hay que darle agua al dominó. Agua, sí, se le da así. Sí, no mucha agua porque es un día sí, un día no. Entonces, por ejemplo, aquí empezó a jugar Chequera. Después jugó, esta ficha la puso Facundo. El seguidor lo puso, no lo puse yo, el seguidor lo puso Espérate, porque estoy bloqueado. Bueno, es muy fácil, jugar, es muy fácil. Pero bueno, cuénteme cómo la está pasando en esta visita a Cuba. How have you enjoyed your trip to Cuba?
Oh, it's been excellent. You know, the people have been wonderful. The food has been excellent. The music, and you know, the Cubans here have all treated my family so nicely. So I'm very, very grateful, and I'm so excited to be able to make this trip.
Eso, un momento emocionante, un momento de respeto mutuo, ¿eh? Estamos muy contentos, muy alegres de que se estén arreglando las relaciones, y no solo las relaciones, también se están arreglando las calles, Mira, usted ve el estadio, qué bonito quedó, de Baseball Stadium, tomorrow.
Oh, well, the baseball game is going to be great. I just hope that no foul balls hit the beast.
¿Eh? No, dice que tenga cuidado que no vaya a ser que una pelota le rompa un cristal a la bestia.
Caramba, viejo, no habíamos pensado en eso, chico.
Muchacho, chiquera, ¿de qué tú hablas? Que es una broma que está haciendo, yo.
Mejor que se vaya con visitaxi.
Claro que sí, que vaya al estadio en visitaxi, y así se preocupa de parqueo.
No, I think I'm going to stick with the beast. That's my car, and I hope nobody does any damage to it. Secret Service would be very angry.
Está bien. Óyeme, bueno, pues de verdad que estamos contentos. Incluso después del estadio, a bailar a algún lugar, dancing, a ver el ballet, o escuchar música, una agrupación de jazz band.
I love jazz, and I love Cuban music. Some of the best musicians in the world are right here in Cuba.
Oh, dice que son los grandes músicos que hay en Cuba, qué bonito. No es contigo, se queda, que no es contigo, que no está diciendo contigo.
Pregúntele si le gustó la comida.
Sí, habló de la comida que le había gustado mucho, probó la comida, unos buenos frijoles negros, plátano maduro frito, puerco asado al carbón, sí, tostones. Do you know what tostones are? Tostones, plátano machacado, Tastes good.
I had some last night. We went to a restaurant, and we had a whole plate full. It was delicious.
Fue un restaurante, de verdad que sí, ay, qué bueno. Bueno, pues, excuse me one moment, con su permiso, necesito jugar un momentico,
Tipo, tú no viste decir que ya esto estaba trancado. Yo lo llevo.
Oye, que trancado ni trancado, que yo si llevo me quedo una ficha y mira, me pegué, gané. Cuando quiera jugamos dominó, you can play domino anytime.
No es fácil.
No es fácil, pero tampoco es difícil,
Well, thank you so much for letting me sit down and visit, but now I have to go. I just want to say how much I appreciate the time that I've spent with you, and please let the Cuban people know and all your friends and family how much we appreciate our visit.
Oh, thank you, muchas gracias, de verdad que sí. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Nos vemos pronto.
Nos vemos pronto.
Gracias.
Gracias. Bueno, hasta luego, nos vemos pronto. Sí. Ay, mi madre, no lo puedo creer, ahora mismo, Obama estaba aquí en mi casa, ustedes se quedaron con la boca abierta.
Boca abierta.
Ay, mi madre, se me olvidó enseñarle la libreta de abastecimiento.
Well, you get the picture, and you see how rather extraordinary that was. And if you're Cuban, there's all sorts of little references and kind of jabs at the system there, including the reference to the BC taxi and the parking and how the streets have been cleaned up for the baseball game and at the very end. Obama looks at the game and he says, it's not easy. And this also is an implicit reference to the whole situation between Cuba and the United States. And Panfilo, of course, responds, it's not easy, but it's not so difficult either. Which became kind of a sub-mantra of the entire visit. This is an example of what I call president-to-people diplomacy as opposed to people-to-people diplomacy. And it truly endeared Obama to the Cuban people, to a degree, frankly, that scared the bejesus out of the Cuban leadership. And I have to say that as someone who studied in depth the declassified history of more than 50 years of assassination plots, paramilitary invasions, Operation Mongooses, and punitive economic sanctions against Cuba, that Obama's trip to Havana really made me proud to be a U.S. Citizen. And it gave me great hope for the future of U.S.-Cuban relations and U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America. Now, Obama was the very first president to take a state visit to Cuba. Calvin Coolidge had gone in 1928, I think it was, but he had been invited to a multilateral conference and did not meet with any of the Cuban leadership. Obama's visit was quite historic. It was a very dramatic, high-profile attempt by his administration to create an unbreakable foundation for his policy of positive engagement with Cuba, and to leave behind in the past what Henry Kissinger once called the perpetual hostility in U.S. policy towards Cuba. And Obama's trip culminated a rather extraordinary breakthrough in bilateral relations that had started several years earlier as Obama began his second term in office. And he began that second term in office really by authorizing a rather extraordinary back-channel diplomatic initiative with the Cubans, the story of which is told in the paperback version of this book, which was published in 2015. We published the book first in October of 2014. When the book first came out, it was written up in the New York Times. I later found out from the secret negotiators in the White House, who were just finalizing this secret deal with Cuba, that they somehow thought that we had gotten a hold of this information that they were working on. And they ran out to get the book and breathed a sigh of relief that we, of course, didn't know anything about the project that they were working on. We had kind of gone up until the Obama period in the hardback edition of the book. And then, of course, the book had this great epilogue written for it by this extraordinary announcement of a breakthrough, and we had to add a whole epilogue to it a year later of how Obama had done this. And how had Obama done this? He authorized two of his top national security aides, Benjamin Rhodes and Ricardo Zuniga, to reach out to the Cubans, suggest to them that there was a lot to talk about, and organize a whole set of secret meetings. Raul Castro responded positively, and he appointed his own son, Major Alejandro Castro Espín, as his top negotiator. And over the next 2 years, 9 secret negotiating sessions were held. Most of them were held in Montreal and in Toronto, as the Canadian government quietly facilitated the talks, arranging for both negotiating teams to enter the country quietly, kind of evade normal immigration procedures, giving them a quiet conference center to do this work in. There was one other meeting in another spot that we don't know about, and then there was a big meeting at the Vatican in October of 2014 that the Pope presided over and lent his divine and moral authority to, finalizing a deal between these two countries. The negotiations addressed kind of an impasse in U.S.-Cuban relations, which was the fact that in Cuba there was a USAID subcontractor named Alan Gross who had been arrested in December of 2009 and had been in prison for a number of years. He had been surreptitiously conducting a project for USAID to basically provide communications equipment to the small Jewish community there that would allow them to have unmonitored access to satellites, the internet, and to eventual communications with U.S. authorities. It was, for all the propaganda around what he was doing, we finally did get the declassified reports on what he was doing and his own proposals for what he wanted to do that left literally zero doubt that this was a quasi-covert operation meant to eventually establish secret communications channels between opposition figures in the future and the Bush administration. which was in power, George Bush was in office when all this started. So Gross had been in prison there. I visited him twice in his cell. And the issue was getting him out, because it was going to be very hard to move forward without getting him out. From the Cuban point of view, the United States had 3 Cuban spies, the last 3 of the so-called Cuban Five, which were a team of agents who had been sent to the United States in the early 90s to monitor militant exile organizations which Cuba believed could pose a terrorist threat eventually to Cuba. And they were arrested by the FBI in 1998, and they'd been in prison, all of them, for, till that point, for anywhere from 13, 14 years when these negotiations started. So the Cubans wanted their spies back, the United States wanted Alan Gross back. Eventually they agreed that the Cubans would not only give Alan Gross back, but also add a CIA asset named Rolando Sharaf Trujillo, who was the CIA's highest mole inside the Cuban intelligence community, and who had been arrested also in 1998, ironically after he had passed intelligence to the United States that allowed them to identify all of the Cuban spy network in the United States, the Cuban Five, the so-called WASP network. And he'd been in prison in Cuba for about 16 years at that point as well. So they arranged this swap over the course of these negotiating sessions, and then moved on to the broader issue, the opening of the door of relations that the spy swap would make possible. And they agreed that they would actually normalize diplomatic relations and reset the relationship between Cuba and the United States. Now, some of you might remember where you were on this iconic day in U.S. Latin American history, December 17, 2014. It's a day that the Cubans refer to as 17 Day, 17D. And anybody who says 17D in Cuba, everybody knows this refers to the day that Raul Castro went on Cuban television at noon, and Barack Obama went on U.S. television at noon, and both of them announced this extraordinary breakthrough. Let me just read to you Obama's opening remarks to the American public that day, just to remind all of us what it is like to hear some eloquence coming from the White House. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba in the most significant changes in our policy in 50 years. We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Today, he continued, America chooses to cut loose the shackles of the past so as to reach for a better future for the Cuban people, for the American people, for our entire hemisphere, and for the world. Now, I, by just fortuitous luck, was in Cuba on December 17, 2014, and I had a picture of myself taken standing next to the television set in the lobby of the Hotel Nacional, where everybody was watching Raul Castro making this announcement, just so I could prove that I was there in Cuba that extraordinary day. And I just can tell you from firsthand knowledge, the country just broke loose in jubilation. People went out into the streets, cars started honking their horns. But part of this was that these spies who had been cast as huge heroes in Cuba were coming back, had actually arrived secretly that morning on a U.S. government plane. But more of it, as the hours went by, and people kind of processed that there was going to be normalization of relations with the United States, was this is really going to make a difference to our future. And one of the waiters at the hotel immediately held out his hand and said to me, "Thank you," as if, we were the people to thank for this. And another taxi driver who took me down to CNN later that day for an interview started talking to me about how all the chauffeurs of the taxis were talking about what this would mean for them, and they all had such expectations of how this would change the Cuban economy. And they said to me, I'm not going to drive this old, American car anymore. I'm going to buy a new Ford van, which gives you a sense of the kind of excitement and expectations. Now, students of U.S. foreign policy that are in this room are going to ask how Obama managed to do what so many of his predecessors had failed to do. As Professor Bill Leogrand and I recount in this book, Back Channel to Cuba, there were other presidents who secretly negotiated with Fidel Castro, John F. Kennedy, Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger did those negotiations during the Ford administration. Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton also conducted back-channel diplomacy with the Cubans in hopes of improving and even normalizing relations. And they had all failed to arrive at this point where Obama arrived. And just so these are the elements that really came to play in his success. For one thing, he did not demand preconditions from the Cubans in return for negotiating. Other presidents had said, you have to expel the Soviets before we'll talk to you. You have to stop sending your personnel out into other countries in Latin America before we'll talk to you. And the Cubans had said, we have the right to our own foreign policy. When you're ready to treat us as an independent state, mutual respect, we'll talk. We don't come to you and say, we're willing to negotiate with you if you, pull out of Angola or pull out of Vietnam or, stop U.S. invasions and interventions in other parts of the world. So there was no quid pro quo for these talks. They were open. They were without conditions, and Obama was willing to take unilateral steps rather than incremental steps towards pushing this forward. And so there was this unique alignment of political stars that made a change in U.S. policy possible. It was the obvious thing to do. And this political stars included that Fidel had passed from the scene and turned power over to Raul Castro. Fidel had retired. That Raul knew that Cuba had to modernize its economy and had started to open the space for a private sector in the Cuban economy. That the rest of Latin America had come to the Obama administration and said, it's time to put this crazy policy you have that affects us in the past and normalize relations with Cuba. And that you had a president who really was dedicated to doing this. So between December 17th, 2014 and January 20th of 2017, when Obama left office, Raul Castro and President Obama managed to replace a Cold War framework of animosity that had dominated 50 years of U.S.-Cuban relations with a 21st century policy of engagement and cooperation. And I just want to give you a short list of what this positive engagement accomplished. Very quickly, it accomplished the reestablishment of full diplomatic relations that had been broken in 1961, the reopening of full embassies in Cuba's embassy in Washington and the U.S. embassy in Havana. It resulted in Obama using his presidential authority to expand the exemptions to the embargo. In other words, create more authorizations for U.S. companies to do business in Cuba. Perhaps the most important of which was Google, which was now authorized to help the Cuban State Communications Agency upgrade and modernize Cuba's servers, which would eventually help provide modern access and fuller access of Cuban people to the internet. There was a dramatic expansion of travel to Cuba, as so many of you who have gone can attest to. Before Obama kind of opened up the policy, circumvented congressional restrictions on travel by adding new exemptions and new categories of travel, fewer people were able to go. And the number of travelers more than quadrupled. Before Obama was about 70,000 a year. After Obama opened up the space, it quickly rose to about 260,000, almost 300,000 a year, and in 2017 reached almost 600,000 people from the United States going to Cuba. This new positive engagement established working groups, Cuban government and the U.S. government, to address issues of disagreement and issues of mutual interest. Among them were counterterrorism cooperation, law enforcement, migration, disaster planning, environmental protection, counter-narcotics collaboration. And through this structure of working together that was established after this great opening, Cuba and the United States signed no less than 22 accords in that brief period of time before Obama left office. And the very last accord that they signed, I think only 2 days before the end of Obama's presidency, in January of 2017, was the end to special treatment for illegal Cuban migration. The so-called wet foot, dry foot policy that had been put into place during the Clinton administration. This was a rather extraordinary policy that kind of created a magnet for Cubans to set out on rickety boats from Cuba to try and reach the shores of the United States. If they actually stepped foot on U.S. land, they were automatically given asylum in the United States. If they were intercepted by the Coast Guard at sea, they would be returned to Cuba. But to normalize migration and to really create safer conditions for Cubans, this policy was ended and Cuba became like any other country with a quota of visas to migrate to the United States. So let me just say and summarize this. Beyond the obvious reduction of a national security threat to Cuba that positive engagement brought, these changes demonstrably benefit Cuban society. There was an extraordinary influx of U.S. tourist dollars that really went, for the most part, to the dramatic and dynamic expansion of the private sector in Cuba. The authorizations allowed companies like Airbnb to start up their business in Cuba and to kind of, network Cubans who were, fairly poor, but actually had homes that they could use for rental spaces if they could have access to the internet like everybody else in the world. And when all this started, there were 2,000 Cuban homes on Airbnb, and within a year there were 22,000 Cuban homes, and now I think it's much closer to over 30,000. And the internet cooperation that Obama authorized contributed far more to the openness and information access in Cuba than any of these covert democracy-building programs that the United States had undertaken in the past. It was really clear when you study this period of time, which is very recent, of course, but as you study it, the benefits of a policy of a civil, respectful relations was working. Now we all, maybe not all of us, but most of us, presumed that this policy would continue in a Clinton administration in 2017. We all thought that it would continue in a Clinton administration in 2017 because we all expected Hillary Clinton to be president, those of us in the kind of progressive Cuba community in Washington. And she ran on a platform openly supporting lifting the embargo. When she was Secretary of State, one of the last things she did was have drafted a pretty comprehensive memo about why Obama should forcefully try and get the embargo lifted. She then wrote about this in her memoir, which she published before she ran for president, making it clear that she wasn't afraid to run in Florida, which she believed had changed its position on relations with Cuba, and get votes there. So there was a sense that the Cuban policy would continue, the policy of engagement would continue under Hillary Clinton, and be fortified, and that she would actually be able to go further than Obama. He normalized diplomatic relations. She would eventually preside over the normalization of economic relations, lifting of the embargo, and the full normal relations with a country with whom we've had abnormal relations with since relations broke down in 1961, and really since the 1959 revolution. Well, as you all know, she wasn't elected. And Donald Trump was elected, and during the campaign he had taken a very different position on Cuba. He, even though in his past he had tried to exploit the opening under the Bill Clinton administration and had secretly sent off scouts to look for hotel opportunities in Cuba as it changed in the late 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ever the opportunist. Now that he was running for president, he adopted the more classic Republican position that the way to win Florida, this pivotal swing state in the Electoral College, was to pander to the anti-Castro exiled community with the harshest language possible. So he ran on a platform that he would abrogate, roll back the deal that Obama had made with the Cubans. And when he won Florida, he attributed this win to the Cuban American community, even though the majority of Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County, which is the stronghold of the exiled community, actually voted for Clinton. But enough of them voted for Trump to help him win that pivotal state. Gone was the civil tone that Obama had established in U.S.-Cuban relations. And if ever that was going to be the case, it was clear that 2 weeks later, after the election, when Fidel Castro passed away, and Donald Trump tweeted, basically, good riddance, that we were entering a new era of relations. And when Trump came in, he actually announced that there would be a major review of the policy. And of course, we were all thinking that this review would just simply be a facade for him changing the policy. The review went on. State Department officials met with Defense Department officials, met with DEA officials, and others who worked on Cuba. The business community weighed in. And lo and behold, the bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy, said this policy is working and it shouldn't be changed. U.S. businesses have established a foothold. The airline industry now, because of Obama, has been authorized to fly, commercial routes to Cuba. Lots of people are going to Cuba. It would be incredibly disruptive to try and break these bridges that have already been built and already been fortified. And that was an eye-opener, that the bureaucracy itself was willing to defend the policy because from an objective point of view, U.S. interests were being advanced. Now, Trump had promised his base in Florida that he was going to do this, and he decided to set a date of June 16th in Miami to give a big speech. And he went down there. He had a very raucous, hardline crowd in front of him, and he basically said, and I quote, "Effective immediately, I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba." And the audience went, "Trump, Trump, Trump." And the president said, "I am announcing today a new policy, as I promised during the campaign, and I will be signing the contract right at this table in just a moment. Our policy will seek a better deal for the Cuban people and for the United States of America. Our new policy will strictly enforce U.S. law. We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime until all political prisoners are freed, freedom of assembly and expression are respected, all political parties are legalized, and free and internationally supervised elections are scheduled." Elections, he said. Now that, of course, is a pretty wide demand to be made, and one that was never going to be honored by the current government of Cuba. And while everybody held their breath, the truth is that he made no real changes to the policy. None of that happened. The deal that Obama had struck was not abrogated. Trump tweaked some of the travel regulations, whereas Obama had authorized people-to-people travel for individuals and said that as individuals, you can all go to Cuba and just designate yourself people-to-people ambassadors, meet with Cubans, talk to drivers, chauffeurs, busboys, waiters, etc., and come back, and you are legitimate travelers under the category of people-to-people. Trump said, no, individuals can't travel to Cuba anymore because we think you're all vacationing on Veradero Beach, which really wasn't true. And instead, if you're going to go to Cuba, you have to go under authorized trips. People were going under authorized trips. More people started going on the cruise ships. Those are authorized trips as well. And then Trump established what he called the Cuba Prohibition list, which was a list of companies that were administered by the Cuban military that he did not want U.S. travelers spending money at. Those involved specific hotels, specific liquor companies, and a bunch of other places. The list had 180 entities on it. Now it has about 212 or so entities on it. And so nothing really changed. And many of us breathed a sigh of relief that this process would still go forward. Except as we were believing that Trump was going to basically let the structures that Obama had created stay in place, this whole crisis, which is going to be known as the Havana Syndrome, broke out at the embassy. A series of inexplicable maladies that affected all of the CIA personnel first in Cuba, and then a number of diplomats and some Canadian diplomats as well. And the news broke about this in August of 2017, and the State Department reduced our personnel in Cuba and then kicked out 2/3 of the Cuban personnel from the Cuban embassy in Washington. And tensions started to rise considerably. U.S. travel to Cuba diminished by over 40% in the first half of 2018 because of the scare about the embassy situation and the fact that the State Department issued a travel alert, basically saying that anybody wanting to travel to Cuba should reconsider travel because the U.S. government couldn't protect them, didn't know what was causing these maladies and couldn't protect them, even though it was absolutely clear that these maladies were targeted. The first 4 people that had suffered them were the CIA station personnel in Havana. And so obviously it had something to do with surveillance, spy versus spy, et cetera. It is still, a year and a half later, not resolved. The FBI does not know what has happened here. All the rumors continue to swirl. You're going to hear more about it in the newspapers soon. And this is where we were until just a couple of weeks ago when the Venezuela crisis broke out. And we're now witnessing what is being called the Cubanization of Venezuela policy. That is to say that the U.S. government, the Trump administration, is pushing for the overthrow of Nicolás Maduro and has started a campaign, and you have to read carefully and listen carefully, to blame the Cubans for Maduro being there. Cuba does have extensive relations with Venezuela, going back to Chavez, who at one point was sending 100,000 barrels of oil to Cuba a day in return for Cuban medical personnel working in Venezuela and other types of Cuban support involvement in Venezuela. And the two countries are tightly aligned. If there's any actual country that would have an influence on Maduro, ironically, it would be Cuba. And for a number of months now, Latin American countries have hoped that Cuba itself could be convinced to push Maduro to leave. But when you listen to Vice President Pence, who's become kind of the spokesman on Venezuela, you see him basically saying, Cuba is next. And just on February 11th, Senator Marco Rubio, who's kind of the shadow Secretary of State now on Latin America, tweeted that the Mafia Maduro family was being supported by the Cuba regime, and for that reason, there will be new sanctions against Cuba very, very soon. So you and I are some of the first to predict and know that in just a few days, if not a couple of weeks, the Trump administration is going to announce new sanctions on Cuba. I believe that they're going to be in 3 categories. One, the Trump administration is going to redesignate Cuba as a sponsor of terrorism and put Cuba on a very small list that's called the States Sponsor of Terrorism list. Right now on the list is North Korea, Syria, Iran, and one or two others, let's see. And to add Cuba to this list means that there's a whole set of economic sanctions and penalties for international businesses that do business with Cuba. Cuba was put on the list back in 1982 by Ronald Reagan, not because it supported terrorism, but because it supported revolution in Central America. Reagan intended to obfuscate the difference between insurrection and terrorism by putting Cuba on this list and punishing Cuba for its support for the Sandinista government in Nicaragua and its support for the revolutionary groups in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. Cuba stayed on the list even though there was no evidence that it was supporting international terrorism as you and I understand international terrorism to be. In fact, it was on the list when a whole series of actual international terrorist events took place in Cuba. Cuba has been a victim of international terrorism over the years, some of it stemming from groups operating with the United States as a base. Barack Obama finally delisted Cuba as part of the normalization efforts in 2015 and 2016. And that was an extremely positive and important step. For Cuba to go back really means a true return to very, very stressful and punitive U.S. policy towards Cuba. The second sanction that's coming, and this is a very complicated one, is that the Trump administration is going to allow U.S. individuals, Cuban-American families, to sue, and some American businesses, to sue in U.S. courts for what Mike Pompeo calls confiscated and trafficked properties in Cuba. That is to say, all of the properties that were expropriated after the revolution, which includes the land that the Jose Marti Airport is on, would be subject to international lawsuits, or lawsuits from the United States. There's an estimate that 200,000 lawsuits could be filed. This would tie up businesses in Mexico, Mexican companies who have investments in Cuba, and German companies, and French companies, and Brazilian companies, and create real havoc and tensions with allied governments. And for that reason, when this law was passed in 1996 as part of the Helms-Burton bill, Bill Clinton insisted that there be a clause allowing presidents to waive the application of what's called Title III of Helms-Burton. And every president since Bill Clinton, including Donald Trump for the first 2 years, has every 6 months waived that provision. And now Secretary of State Pompeo is saying that businesses abroad should watch out. They better reconsider whether they are trafficking in confiscated properties and abetting the Cuban dictatorship. And then I'm sad to say, because I know a lot of you want to go to Cuba, that I'm very concerned that there are going to be further restrictions put on our ability to freely travel to Cuba. And I would just point out to you that Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont is about to introduce a freedom to travel bill which would lift all restrictions on our ability to freely go to Cuba like we can go to any other country. And if that bill passes, it will address these new sanctions on travel. How it'll ever get signed by the president, I do not know. But these sanctions overall are going to do serious damage to the Cuban economy. And even more extraordinarily for me, they're going to be, if not a major blow, a crippling blow to continuing positive engagement with Cuba. I wish I had better news. Believe me, having been there to witness the dawn of this new relationship with Cuba, it's really difficult to watch this model of diplomacy, civility, and progress that the Obama administration worked so hard to accomplish, and the Cubans also worked so hard to accomplish, start to go down the drain faster and faster as the crisis with Venezuela expands. And maybe I'll be proven incorrect. My mother used to call me Peter Pessimist when I was young, and I'd love to be optimistic. And just to be optimistic, go back finally in the end here with the more positive days of the Barack Obama speech in Cuba and the conclusions with which he left the Cubans and us at that time. He finished his speech by saying, "The history of the United States and Cuba encompasses revolution and conflict, struggle and sacrifice, retribution, and now reconciliation. It is time now for us to leave the past behind. It is time for us to look forward to the future together." And here he made a reference to the Panfilo dialogue. And it won't be easy. It won't be fácil. It won't be easy. And there will be setbacks. It will take time. But my time here in Cuba, he said, renews my hope and confidence in what the Cuban people will do. We can make this journey as friends and as neighbors and as family together. Si se puede, he finished. Muchas gracias.